Hi there, welcome to the Introduction to SmartConnect video. In this video we'll be walking you through some of the basics in SmartConnect just to get you started. Now this video is going to be about the on-premise deployment of SmartConnect, so if you are going to be using the cloud deployment of SmartConnect, you'll want to be watching the other introduction video. Everything in SmartConnect begins with connections. So we have many different types of connections that are out there. I'm not sure which connection you've purchased SmartConnect to use with. However, you can see we've got a number of basic out-of-the-box ones. We've got NAV and GP, CRM, Salesforce, NetSuite, lots of different options out there. And if you notice around here, we've also got this Magento, for example, this one that straight up says REST. You can also connect to pretty much any REST API that's out there on the internet. Now, according to a recent study by Postman, that gets you to about 89% of the internet of the apps that are out there. So there's a good chance that any of those single-purpose apps that you're running could be used as both a source and target for SmartConnect, and you'll understand source and target in a little bit as we go through that. We do have a couple of more generic ones as well for the on-premise world. We have SQL Server, which can support either SQL Server on-premise or SQL Server hosted on Azure, and we do have ODBC. Now, the difference with ODBC compared to some of these other connectors is that ODBC can only be used as a data source. So if you do have an old QuickBooks, maybe an old Access database kicking around, we can talk to those as a data source as well. So when you go through a connection setup, it's a one-time setup. I'm just going to use GP as my example, where you'll come in and each connection will look a little bit different depending what it is you're connecting to. Each of them is documented out there on our website. So if you go to our knowledge base, you can find documentation on connecting to each of these different types of connector. You're simply going to come in here, fill in the information for the connection that you're working with. When you're done, you click on Save, and then that connection can be used as many times as you want in as many integrations as you want. It can be both a source and a destination, unless it's ODBC, of course. So from there, you can move on to creating data sources. Data sources is you telling SmartConnect what you want to pull from your source system for your integration. The reason we have data sources broken out separately from the integration itself is that you can use one data source across many integrations, which is pretty cool. I'm going to click on Create here because while we're talking about sources, we also need to talk about triggering integrations. So we can have a real-time data source for many of our connections. You can see here the ones that are listed. A real-time data source means as soon as a change is made, so a record is created or updated, the source system will kick off a SmartConnect integration immediately. So it'll take that one document, for example, my customer that just got updated in GP. I can now push that information to my CRM immediately. A change data source is similar to a real-time data source in that your data source is tracking changes that have been made. Rather, it's tracking records that have been changed. It won't be storing what value changed within those data sources, but it will be tracking, this customer got updated. And then usually on a schedule, sometimes manually, the process will get executed, and once that integration process runs, it'll process all the changes that have been made since the last time that map ran. Now, the nice thing about a change data source is if something happens technologically along the way and either the source or the destination isn't available, then the change record will sit there waiting to be processed until the source or the target is available. Whereas a real-time, I would have to actually go into error processing and then re-kick off that record because real-time tries it at the time. So if you have any type of concerns about the accessibility or the reliability of your source or your target, then I would always set it up as a change trigger and put it on a schedule. Honestly, a process that's been scheduled for every 15 minutes or so is close enough to real time for the average user. Everything else is either bulk, so if it's coming from a data source that is not a file or a folder, it's considered bulk. And then we've got files and folders. Now, with files and folders, we can do all the files. So, we've obviously got Excel and CSV out there, but we can also do all the other delimiters. Pipe files have made a comeback lately, but we can do tab delimited, whatever delimiter you need within your text file. We can also do a JSON file if that's what you need, and obviously XML as well. Now you might notice that each of these files has a version of itself plus a folder data source. If I go with just the file source in here, I can name it, I can choose an actual file to be my model, Then I can choose which sheet within that file is appropriate. That's going to show me my data when I click on preview, and I can see all of my columns and my headers and such. I can have the users choose the file at runtime if I want. So if this is going to be a dynamic workbook, where my users are, generating a file and that they want to come in here and manually run the process, I'm going to have it select the file at runtime, right? Especially if that file is going to have different names as it goes. Normally, I would be using the file data source this way if in a couple of different scenarios. If I have a file that's being sent to me that's just being saved to a specific spot in my network, or if I'm going to be using the Excel add-in from Excel, I will use this as well. In both of those cases, I wouldn't want the file to be selected at runtime. Select file at runtime would, again, only be if I want my users to save the file somewhere, maybe even locally on their computer, and then run the SmartConnect process manually inside of SmartConnect. Once I turn this on, I can't schedule this map to run. Where this is different from its folder data source, click on Create. When I go to the Excel folder data source, what it does now is, again, I can give it a name. Now I'm choosing a template file. Instead of that one static file here in that exercise folder where I had it, I'm going to go to another folder where I've got a template stored. Now, quick note on this. If you notice, we've got 4 folders set up in here. We've got our template folder, which is where I'm going to go. This is where we store the file that gives us the file structure. Generally within my template, I want to have one row for my column headers, and then I'm probably going to have usually a couple rows worth of data just to show SmartConnect what the data types for each of those fields is. But for now, I'm going to select my exercise 5 template file here. I'm going to choose which sheet the data is on. And now SmartConnect's asking me, where will the files be stored? Where do you want them to move when there's a success? Where do you want them to move when there's a problem? So I'm going to go through and pick my source folder. Now here's the thing about these folder names. You don't need them to be called source, success, and failure. Quite often, maybe under source we'll just have, quite often I don't even have a source folder. I just have the main folder where I drop my source files. Then I've got success, which I'll very often call archive, and failure, which I'll very often call error. Depending what's intuitive to your users, we don't need these folders to be named exactly what they are. However, for the purposes of this example, we actually do have them named for exactly what they are. Whoops, I chose success there, didn't I? So I'm going to go through and pick my source, my success, and my failure. The next thing we need to talk about is what to do if our file is empty. So I do have a couple of choices here. I could leave the file where it is. Now, for me personally, I try never to leave the file where it is for a couple of different reasons. First, it clutters up your source folder if you ever want to go there and just review what's currently in your source folder. But also, what's going to happen with this is we're going to schedule SmartConnect to watch that folder, maybe every minute, every 5 minutes, every 10. And check for files that are in there. Now, as it finds files in that folder that match the template as far as structure goes, it adds that file to our source, our query. Now, if we keep cluttering it up with empty files, eventually it has to check, 20, 30, 40 files, and that will slow down my process eventually. It makes it less efficient. So generally what I tell people is move it to either success or failure. Now, the next question would be, of course, how do I make that decision? And really you need to look at the process that you're building. So if I'm building an integration from, importing items from a CAD program into my ERP, for example, I'm going to schedule that to run every 15 minutes or so. I want to stay up to date, but we're maybe not creating new items every 15 minutes. Our CAD solution, although we're using it quite regularly, maybe new item gets created once a day. But like I said, we don't want to just run the process once a day. So in that case, the file being empty makes total sense. So I'm going to move it to a success. Now, if I'm importing transactions from my online store is very busy. Even though I'm going every 15 minutes, if I have an empty file, it's an indicator that there might be a problem. So I might choose to move that to failure. Again, look at your integration and say, how realistic is it that my file might be empty? If it's probable, it should always be a success. If it's not likely or not preferable that my file be empty, then I'm going to move it to failure, because you'll see later on when we talk about tasks, moving it to failure will kick off my failure tasks and send somebody an email to say, hey, we got an empty file. Now, generally what I'll do is I will append the date time to the file when I move them, and that takes away the need to worry about overriding destination files. It also tells us when did that file get processed, so whether or not it's in success or failure folder, we know when it got processed, so it's easier to go and find that file downstream. And then I usually turn off this create real-time trigger. Generally what I'll do is set this up on a schedule just so that I can work it in around other integrations. Once I'm done with this, so I can validate it and I can save it. Alright, now again, using a folder data source versus a file data source. A folder is I have many users maybe filling in template files, maybe it's accounts payable or journal entries or any number of things. Or again, I'm receiving files from somebody and I want to drop them into that source folder. Quite often I get third-party logistics providers will send me files on a regular schedule, stuff like that. I want to drop them in that source folder and then let SmartConnect process them as and when it finds them. Now, the one type of data source we didn't really dig into there was bulk. Bulk is basically everything we haven't talked about. So all of my REST APIs can be bulk. So when I talk about a REST API being a bulk data source, it's really all of my GET endpoints. So everything that's getting data from that REST API. You can see we've got others, all the others that are listed here that are all the same as the connectors we talked about earlier, including ODBC as a source. Each one of those sources will look a little bit different depending what it is that you're connecting to. For example, the SQL data source would be a SQL query. In the case of a GP data source, it's going to be either a SQL query or you actually have the ability to drill in and see everything using its display names. You also have Extender here if you happen to be a GP customer who's also running Extender. And the last one I do want to talk about is a multi-data source, because what this allows you to do is to combine, mix and match other data sources. So I can come in here and I can add in multiple sources here. Again, they would normally be bulk, but maybe I want to talk about grabbing my customer data source, new customers to Salesforce, for example. Okay, and then I want to add a second one called Salesforce accounts. Okay, now what I can do is I can give those an alias. So even though their data source, even though they're coming from different solutions, now what I can do is click on modify, and I can actually pull fields from both. So I've got my Excel data source. And I've got my Salesforce data source, okay, which unfortunately doesn't have any columns in it. All right, we'll delete this. The last one I want to talk about in here is a multi-data source. So what a multi-data source allows you to do is take two or more other data sources and connect them together through joins. And the cool thing about this is they don't have to be coming from the same spot. So one way that a multi-data source often gets used is I'm going to compare my source to my target with a left join, and I'm going to filter out any records that already exist in my source or in my target, so that a lot of times with the REST API, for example, all it can tell me is all of the orders that got processed today, but it can't tell me if I've already entered those orders into my ERP. So I'll create a multi-data source. I will left join my new orders from my online store with my ERP sales orders, and I will select only the ones that don't currently exist. To give you an example of what one of those looked like, I do have a multi-list data source here. And you can see what we've done. We've got a query, an ODBC query here looking at our demo database. We have a Dynamics GP query that's looking at Dynamics GP, and we've basically built a view around that where not only am I choosing my columns dynamically, but I can also control my join here. So I'm going to right click on that and say I'm getting all of my joins from the order list. Okay, and I'm going to connect that in a left-handed way, and then I'm going to have a filter in my columns down here that says I only want ones where this number is null. Okay, so that way now I'm only getting the ones that I haven't processed in the past. So that's a quick introduction to a multi-data source and how we use those. And that's a quick introduction to sources in general. The next thing to talk about is the integrations themselves. All right, now it doesn't matter what my source and what my target is for any particular integration. This window is always going to look the same, and that's one of the cool things about SmartConnect is building the integration regardless what our source and target are is exactly the same every time I do it. Up here in the top part, I am choosing my data source. So in this case, you can see it's an Excel file that we're choosing. But again, I could go through and choose as a bulk change or real time, and which particular one is it? Sorry, which particular source is it? Okay, now you might notice this data source keys section here. Now what this is doing is you're using this list, and you're going to check off all the ones that apply, to tell SmartConnect how do I identify an individual document within this file. So for example, if I'm importing some sales invoices, probably what I've got is some header information and some line information. So basically what happens is 10 rows within my data set might be one individual invoice, and then the next 5 rows might be a second invoice, for example. So I'm going to choose all the information, all the columns that I need to tell SmartConnect these 10 rows are this order and these 5 rows are that order. I will tell you that a lot of times when I'm troubleshooting a SmartConnect process, maybe 80% of the time it has the data source keys chosen incorrectly. So this is one area where you want to make sure that you make the right choice. I can preview my data if I want to, just to see what columns are there. My spreadsheet is empty. Next, I have to choose my destination. Now, destination can be all the connectors we talked about earlier, with the exception of ODBC. So I can write to a REST API. When I talk about REST APIs, that's all my put, post, patch, deletes should show up in here when we get there. GP, nav. I'm choosing GP for this particular example, but again, very little about what I'm covering is unique to the GP. Okay. Now this section here will change a little bit depending what my connection is. For example, like I said before, if it was a REST API, I would only have one drop down here where I choose which endpoint. If this was Nav or Business Central, I would have a drop down and I would be choosing what they call web services. If this was SQL, I would have a drop down that chooses which table I want to write to, or tables. So it's a little bit different per connector. In this case, like I said, it's Dynamics GP, so we have to choose what module we want to work with. We have to choose what within that module we want to do. And then down here, regardless of our connection, down here are what we call nodes. Okay, each of those connections will list nodes differently down below, so your screen might look a little bit different than mine when you're going through, but hopefully it'll make sense as you go. Now, a couple of other things I want to talk about while we're up here. This destination type, normal or file, if you're most of the time you're going to leave this to normal, which means it's going to write directly to all of the nodes that you've chosen to map down below. Again, we'll map those in just a minute. If I'm having trouble, so quite often I'll get an error message, something like unable to convert string to int16, and I'm looking at my data and I don't think I'm passing in a string to a number field and I just can't figure it out. If I click onto File, what's going to happen is instead of writing to the actual nodes, it's going to create a file for the data that it's sending to each of those nodes. Then I can run the process and review the files and see what have I done, what is happening within my data that I'm actually sending that the destination doesn't like. Okay, it's one of the first steps in troubleshooting a SmartConnect process is to figure out what data am I actually sending. So I'm going to switch that back to normal for now. Another concept down here that applies to many of our connectors is this concept of companies. Now, we are unique in the industry. We deal with multiple company scenarios very differently from any of the other integration platforms that are out there. We have two different ways that you can have one map interact with multiple companies within a destination. I can check off all the boxes that I want this integration to hit. So for example, let's assume I wanted to import a chart of accounts to my ERP. Usually I want those accounts applied to all of my companies within my ERP environment. The problem with every ERP environment out there is to create those manually. Let's say there's 10 accounts and I've got 5 companies. I need to go into one company, manually create those 10 accounts, and then go to the other 4 companies one at a time and still create those. I'm doing the same thing 50 times. I could create for my users an Excel workbook where they put those 10 GL accounts. I can give them our Excel add-in, which I'll show you all later. The Excel add-in would then go to this map. I can mark all the companies off, pretending, of course, I had those 5 companies. I mark all those companies so that when that workbook gets executed, it hits all 5 companies at the same time with all 10 accounts, and my user had to do way less work than they would have had to do if they went through the front end. The other way we deal with multi-company is this define button up here. So I'm going to turn off all these checkboxes. So I don't want to select them by hard code, so I don't want to force this transaction to a company, but I can click on define here. Now the scenario for this would be I've got a lot of my peripheral systems in a business, so my CRM, my payroll, my warehouse management, project management. Quite often those are all set up globally within my organization. So my sales team throughout the world operates in one CRM organization. However, many companies will have multiple company databases within their ERP based on tax rules, based on ownership rules. There's many different reasons to have multiple companies within your ERP. So what this allows you to do is to use some code to go through and look at your source columns and find something that says this record has to go to that company. For example, normally I would have maybe even a company key, which that would be ideal. But if I don't have a company key, some kind of field that says this is company X, maybe I'm looking at sales territory, maybe I'm looking at the salesperson, maybe there's something about the customer that tells me there has to be some rule. So what I can do now is, set up the code to say if this field is Northern US, then I can choose my US company. And I can just pull that into my script as well. Okay, so we're not going to get too much into scripting here, but I need you to understand that we do have that ability to deal with multiple companies in those two different ways from a single map. That's going to create a lot less maintenance for yourself downstream. It's going to be much more efficient when you're processing. Now I'll reselect that before someone yells at me. So the next thing we need to talk about is the actual mapping. Now I'm going to go into this add line item mapping just to use it as our example. Now when you look at this window, again, like I said before, it really doesn't matter what our source or what our target is. I'm always seeing my source fields over here on the left. I'm always seeing my target fields over here on the right. Now mapping can be a simple matter of dragging and dropping. So I can, for example, click on this VIP field. I can drag it over here and drop it in anywhere that I need to drop it in. Or if I don't like dragging and dropping for some reason, I do have a drop-down box available within the fields themselves that will get me to all of the source columns on a list, and I can go through and choose whichever one I want. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on delete here to clear that field because that mapping wasn't appropriate. It just was me showing you dragging and dropping. Now some of the ways we make this a little bit easier for you is within the interface itself, particularly on the destination side. So for example, all these fields that are in red, these are the fields that we know are required. So as at a bare minimum, my integration has to populate all of these red columns. Now we've got that for many of our connectors. So while you're out there building, if you see red, it means you have to populate that field for that connector. Now all these other fields, your own business process might require you to populate them. For example, we're putting price level in here as retail. That's not a required field for the integration, but it's a required field for my integration. Okay. Another way we make it easier is if you see this word list here and you see you've got list options. If this is a connector that we're aware of, we'll take a look at lists and list fields or drop-down fields or radio boxes when that are within your applications, and we'll fill in the actual words for you. So in this case, I've got different document types that are stored. This list makes sense if I was looking at the front end of this particular ERP. However, at the database level, these are actually stored as numbers. So rather than make you figure out the numbers, we're going to go ahead and give you this list and you can choose the document type by word. We also have the ability to do things like local constants. You can see right here. So I'm hard coding the value warehouse into this field. Which every time I write a row into this particular node, it's going to use warehouse within that field. So it's pretty common that I'm always putting the same value in a particular field, so I'm going to use that. Now, if I have other things, so I've shown you list option where I can choose a value, I've shown you a local constant. If I have to transform my data in other ways, I've got this additional columns up here. Now, we're not going to dig into every individual additional column simply because the list is slightly different when you go from connector to connector. But what I can do is walk you through some of them, what we're looking at. So you will see from time to time these rolling columns. Okay. Now rolling columns are incremental numbers. In the case of this one, the GP rolling column, this is actually reaching into the ERP, GP in this case, and getting the next incremental number from the accounting system so that I don't have to invent one on my own. Okay, but custom rolling column is if my ERP doesn't have that available to me, I can create, or if I'm in a field where normally there is no such thing as an incremental number, I can create my own incremental number here. And the cool thing about all of these different additional columns is they're no code, right? So I can just call this Rod's number, and I can tell you what the next number is based on, so I'm going to call it Rod, and the next number will be Rod 00201, and then after that it'll be 202, 203. You get the gist of it. In the case of rolling columns, either the GP rolling column, which I'll show you the one there in a second, or in our rolling column, you're going to see this used for global variable available to you. Now we're going to talk about global variables in a little bit, but In this case, there's a global variable called document number, I believe it's called, global document number. This would populate that field with this value, and then I can use that in any notifications I want to send in a task or anything like that. Okay, here is the GP rolling column 1, so I'm going to choose what module we're using, what company, and what document type we're using to populate this. One other one that's used quite often is a date column. Okay, now what this allows us to do is to really convert date formats. So I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to choose which field. So document date, for example, I'm looking at. What was the format in the field in the data source, and what do I need the format to be in my destination? Okay, so in other solutions, I would have to figure out the code to move those date parts around. In this case, all I have to do is a couple drop downs. If I do need a new date format that maybe isn't listed out there, I can come in here and I can create new date formats. Okay, now here's the thing with the date formats and why this is important, especially as you move out into the internet with the integrations that you're building. There are a world of date formats out there. It's crazy how many there are. So this is your quickest way to work with those and get that data converted on the way in. One of the other very popular ones is translation. So very similar to what I showed you with list option, we're really doing a translation for you. So what this allows you to do is look at a particular column. So let's look at each, for example. Okay, so this might be a unit of measure field, and I can use a translation table here to convert it. So basically what we're saying is, if the value in my source column is X, I want to return 1. If the value in my source column is Y, I want to return 2, right? If we were using the values here in that document type that I talked about earlier, what I could do is have it convert invoice to 3, order to 2, quote to 1, whatever the numbers are that correlate whatever I have to write into the database. It's basically a select case here. If I need to add a new translation, so there isn't one that exists that does what I'm trying to do, I can click on this plus sign here and create or maintain a table. So if I pull up account type here, for example, you can see that whenever I see posting, I turn it to 1, or vice versa. Whenever I see, looks like they convert 1 to 1 as well. I'm not sure why they do that. Normally I would see the 1 over here and posting over here so that I could use it in both directions. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now the next thing to do is talk about what to do if we don't have something mapped. So I would normally say return failure for the current integration line. What that's going to do is kick off all of our failure tasks. It's going to notify the user that there was a problem. Sometimes I've seen people return default values. So basically, with that list of document types, I'm going to have 5 values, and if they pass in a value that isn't those 5 values, maybe I just return the first value by default. So again, I have lots of different choices here. So from a no-code solution standpoint, I'm going to click on one more, and that's this MS SQL lookup. Now in this case, it's a SQL lookup because the connector I'm using has a SQL backend, or SQL, depending who you are. Right. Now what we're doing here is choosing what are we looking up on the fly. So one good example that I like to use in this case is I get a price sheet from my vendor, and my vendor has given me their UPC number, right? Well, that's not how GP in this case gets updated. I need an actual item number, and this is true for BC or F&O or any of the other ERPs you might be dealing with. So instead of saying to my buyer, can you go and fix the Excel workbook by putting our item numbers in there, I can do a SQL lookup. So I can take a look at the actual database that I'm looking at. I can find my table. So in my case, it's going to be IV00101 that I'm looking up against. Okay, I can return what field I want to return. Okay, again, what do I do if there's no data? I'm going to return an error. Okay, and then I add in my lookup criteria, right? And this is where I'm going to say from my source field, I want to use my UPC number. Okay, and in my targets, I'm going to choose what field I'm looking up against. Okay, so I've built that out with no code at all, and I'm doing a SQL lookup, and it's being returned as part of my data set. Now, the reason I like to show you this is that lookup will exist for many of our different connector types, right? So if it's SQL based, then obviously you're going to get a SQL lookup. But if you have a REST API that you're working with, there's an equivalent REST lookup as well. If you're in Business Central, you'll find an OData lookup that looks exactly the same. So those lookups do exist for many of our connectors. Now, there are other no-code solutions that you're going to find on other connectors. The purpose of this intro video isn't to deep dive into each of those different types, but hopefully you've got a sense of just how easy we're trying to make it. Now, in cases where I don't have a no-code solution available to me, or if I just prefer to write code, which some people are that way, I can come in here and I can build an actual calculated field. So over here on the left, we've got lots of things to try to help you build that. But basically, you can use VB.NET or C# to decide how you're going to code it. So if I've got, you know, 3 different lookups I have to do, and then I have to compare the values of those 3 lookups, I would build my 3 lookup columns, and then I would come in here and build the code that compares them or concatenates them, stuff like that. So that's our additional columns. Once there's an additional column made, you'll see it shows up here on the left as just as any other part of our integration or any other part of our data source, including our calculation here on the date field. So then I can just drag and drop those in. I can get them from the right-hand side drop downs as well, if that's what floats my boat, and we're good to go. A couple last things to talk about while we're in here is we've got update existing. Now, update existing will decide what happens if a record already exists. There's a concept that some of you will be aware of called upserting. Now, basically what that means is the solution will check, does this record exist? If the record does exist, we'll update it, and if it doesn't exist, we'll create it. Now, we went a little further than that because we're always checking whether the source record exists in our target. If you do have update existing turned on, you get access to this update blank data. Update blank data means all these fields that we haven't mapped, right? When I'm creating the record, I'm asking my target system to apply its business logic and update all these other fields, right? All the empty fields will get updated based on business logic. If I turn on update blank data, that's going to happen as well. Right, so it'll apply all of that business logic and all the fields will get recalculated. If I only want to update the fields that I've mapped, then I'm going to turn off update blank data, and then only the records we pass in will get updated. Not all the other business logic will get applied. Okay, you will see cases where I need to group data. Now this is a little different from my source keys, so let me show you an example of that. I'm in updating lines right now, so I don't have to, you can see I'm adding a line item. I don't have to group because each row within my data source represents an invoice line in this case. But in the case of the header, so if I scroll down here a little bit and look at my create sales transaction, oh, they didn't group it, but they should have. So we'll go fix that. Now here, if you remember I said before, I might have 10 records in here, or 10 rows in my source that represent one sales document. So in this case, I only want to create one sales document header. I don't want to create this 10 times. That would be inefficient. So what I'm going to do is group this data, and I'm going to figure out what makes a unique row for this particular node that I'm in. So in my case, I'm going to group it based on SOP number, right? Once I've got that SOP number, I know I'm going to be updating this only one time instead of the 10 times. Okay, you could have multiple columns in here that are identifying what a single record is for this particular node, but that's what Groupon does, and that's the concept. So if you remember, we have the source keys, which are telling us how do we associate these 10 rows to each other so that we process it all as one document. In this case, the Groupon is how do I get one unique record, or how do I get the required unique records for this particular part of my integration. All right, so at this point you do have an actual working integration. You've gone through, you've created your source. Well, first you created your connection, then you created your source, then you came in here and created the integration. But we've kind of hinted that there's more to it than just what we've looked at so far. So I'm going to take a quick look at options because there's a couple of things in there that again lead into tasks, and then we're going to take a look at tasks. All right, among my options, there's a couple of different things that I do ask folks to go through and set up. First is allow any user to run this integration. So eventually we're probably going to have this integration set up on a schedule, which means I want to have at least the schedule user be able to run this integration. By default, it's only going to want to be run by the people who created it. Next is if there is no data returned from the maps data source. Okay, so again, this goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about the file data sources. We have to decide based on our integration and based on our schedule, is it okay for the data source to be empty? If it is okay, we return map success. If it's not okay, we return a map failure to at least let people know that no records were found. Okay, using the log, this is important for some of the troubleshooting we'll be talking about in a little while. So at a minimum, I like to log errors and log error source data. That's going to allow us to do something later on when we talk about processing errors. Okay, for the first little while of an integration, I'll sometimes turn on log successes just so that I can show to people who might be questioning whether or not it's succeeding. After a while, though, I'd turn that back off because you don't need to log successes all the time. Okay, so those are basically the three checkboxes we'll look at there. And then here I talked about the scripting language being VB.NET or C#. You're going to make that choice on each map. We do default to VB.NET, but if you're a C# person, you can go ahead and change that. So those are the options that really matter for most of the processes we're looking at. So the next thing we need to talk about is tasks. Tasks are what turn your integration into more of an application. So you can see I've got different times when tasks can be run. I can run them before the actual integration. I can run them before the document or after the document succeeds or fails, or I can run them after the integration itself succeeds or fails. Now a quick note is that on the integration failing is if I pass through 10 documents and 2 of those documents fail, or even 1, or 9, or all 10, if any one of those documents fails, the tasks that run if the integration fails will be all executed. In that case, even though, so I'm going to go back to my original statement of 10 documents, 2 of them failed. Even though 8 of them succeeded, the tasks that run if the integration succeeds will not get executed. The tasks that run if the document succeeds will get run for all 8 that succeeded. The tasks that run if the document fails will get executed for the 2 that failed. But the tasks that run if the integration fails are the only ones that get executed at the integration level, even though 8 of them succeeded. All right, now we can talk about the different types of tasks that are out there. So if I go down, if I right click on the timing of the process that I want to create, and then I click on new task, I can see that there's many different types here. Now I don't dig into too much the file based ones simply because Generally, if I need files to be moved around as part of my integration, I'm going to use a folder data source if that's possible. If it's not, you can come in here, and those are no-code solutions. You're just going to choose, for example, in the delete file, where's the file stored, what's the file called, and it's going to delete. You can see here we do have run script as an option. Now, just like before, this is either VB.NET or C#. We do have many helper functions over here on the left-hand side. We've got source columns available to you, and you can build out a script. One good use case for this that's pretty common for us, we deal a lot with SAP Concur, and when you're dealing with SAP Concur, if you don't pay for their extra REST API service, then you have to actually download a file from their FTP server and decrypt it. So instead of asking a user to do that manually, which doesn't add any value to our integration process, I'm going to use a script to reach out to that FTP server, pull that file down, and then decrypt it. So now basically I'm preparing it. So that would be set up as a before integration task. Okay. Some of the other types that are in here, I can run a SQL command. So when I come in here, I'm going to choose which SQL server am I working with, what database, stuff like that. Okay, and I can then execute a SQL command. One common case here is I've probably got my data staged in a staging table somewhere, and maybe I've got a field that's keeping track of the status of that document. So after the document succeeds or after the document fails, I can update that staging table with what's going on with that record. Another way that I commonly use these is if I need to tweak data after it's been imported to my data source. So I push it into my ERP, I let all the business logic get applied, and then I want to go through and tweak a couple of fields. I can do that as well through a SQL command. Okay, and then the other types of stuff that you'll see in here are messaging. So I can send an email, I can send a message to Slack, Teams, or Trello. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and use send email just because it's pretty common. But again, if you are a customer who uses Teams, Slack, or Trello, you may choose to update your users through one of those channels instead. My purpose here is just to show you the no-code part of it and to show you how you're going to communicate error messages in particular to your end users. Okay, so again, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to fill in a to. One best practice here, just while we're talking best practices, I wouldn't put in, Betty@mycompany.com because Betty might win the lottery tomorrow and not come back. So generally what I'm going to try to do is use some type of alias to send to. So I'll set that up under my email server, whatever that is, and I would just send this to the process owner email address. I do want to choose a single process owner if I can. If I send emails to a group of people, it's very common for the entire group to assume somebody else in the group will take care of it. Now, the person that I send this email to doesn't have to be the person who will resolve it. It has to be somebody who can oversee the resolution of the issue. So then I can fill in CC, BCC, and from if I want to. I'm going to go straight to subject because I want to talk about this little book here. I have these global variables available to me that I can use within my message. So I might want to choose, for example, the map ID one. And I can go through and say there was an error with this process. Okay. And now I can build out the actual message. And again, I've got lots of variables here. So I'm going to include in my message a lot of different variables, things like what was the run number, what was the start time, how many records were there in the entire integration, how many records failed. Okay, and the most important one that I'm going to include is this one here, global run errors. Okay, now what that's going to do for my users is give them a list. If you remember, I said I passed in 10 documents, 2 of those documents failed. It's going to list all of the error messages associated with those 2 documents that failed. Okay, so hopefully that's going to tell my users, now you need to go and fix either the source or the destination. I've effectively poked them in the belly button. It's time for them to go and fix their data. So then hopefully this record will get processed again later on in our integration, or we might need to reprocess it, which I'll show you in a minute. So once I've set that up, it would show up here. Now, quick note on those sending messages to Teams, Slack, Trello, or email, they don't always have to be negative. I present them to help you process errors because that's an important part of every integration is you need to communicate with people when there's a problem. But you can also communicate with people when there's not a problem. Here at E1 Solutions, when you placed the order for SmartConnect in the first place, your account manager received an email that told them who you were. It told them what you had purchased, and if you purchased other things besides SmartConnect, it would have included that as well. And then it basically tells them that it's time to work with you to A, give you access to this very training, but also to work with our operations team to make sure that you get the best implementation experience that you could possibly get. So that doesn't have to be negative. You can use them. I do caution you to not overdo it with the positive emails because it's really easy to set up a rule in Outlook to ignore particular emails. All right, the last thing to talk about in this window is our scheduler. So when I come in here, you can see that I can have any schedule that I want. We're super flexible. We can have it every single day, certain days of the week, certain days of the month, or even just one time if I need this to execute on Saturday night because I'm going live on a project. I can have it execute overnight. When I choose weekly, I can choose what time of day I want it to start. I can choose the days of the week I want to run this. I can choose to repeat it as little as every minute, but honestly, like I said, in practice, 15 minutes is a good number for most integrations if I need them to run near real time. One quick note on the timing of it though, even though we allow for as little as every minute, you want to make sure there's enough space in there for your process to actually execute. So if I have a process that takes 3 minutes to execute on average, I don't want to set up my schedule to run every minute. You're going to confuse the scheduler. So probably what I'm going to do is set, if it's a 3-minute process, I'll probably set the map to run every 5 minutes, just to make sure that we've given it time to finish off before we try to execute it again. Okay, next I'm going to choose an end time for my process. So I might start it at 8 a.m. just before people get here and finish at 8 p.m. just after people go home for the night. Okay, so this map will stay active until I uncheck this active box or until I delete it. I'm going to delete it for my example. So that's it. You've built an entire SmartConnect process at this point. You've gone through, first you created your connections, then you created your sources, then you created the actual mappings within the integrations window, then you schedule it if you're going to schedule it. Okay, you added some tasks within your mapping to help you manage errors, manage good stuff, manage bad stuff, do other things that you might need to do. So that's really all there is to talk about from an integration standpoint. You've created your connection, you've created your source, you've created your integration, you added some tasks to your integration to help turn your integration into more of an application, and you scheduled it. So hopefully this is enough to get you started with SmartConnect, and if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are support at e1solutions.com, or feel free to check out our knowledge base as well. We've got a really thorough knowledge base out there. You can go to e1solutions.com to find that, and hopefully any information you need will be there. Thanks again, and happy integrating.